I figured I might be not speaking too harsh to those who have come on and said Jesus didn't exist, he was a myth or whatever. But I haven't realized, I need to keep in mind that you guys haven't gone through the early church fathers and read various New Testament scholars and what they said and what's accepted. You guys haven't gone in depth like that. So I figured I'd give you what happens at a university in a critical approaching the New Testament from a critical historical view, and with a teacher who is not a practicing Christian. Um, the first thing you look at is how did scholars examine the scriptures. Um, and what do the scriptures say? This is the most basic question a university student is asked to answer. In an actual New Testament studies class, questions are: what does the writer of Matthew believe about Jesus and the mission of the early church? But it wouldn't be phrased like that. I would just ask, what does Matthew believe about? What does he write? What does he believe about Jesus and the early church? Because the Gospels are all considered anonymous because they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't really have any other information on that. We don't have names attached. They're just names attached to these, but they consider it. There's nothing within the text that says John wrote this or Matthew or Mark wrote this or Luke did, which is unlike the epistles of Paul and Peter and John, where it states the person who's writing it. So they're considered anonymous. But every single copy of Matthew is known as Matthew. Every single early church Christian, early church father, every single Christian from the earliest times to the latest times, from Spain to India, from Russia to Ethiopia, always addresses Matthew as Matthew. And whenever it quotes from it, it calls it Matthew. Same with Mark, same with John, same with Luke. So the titles were very early on, and there's kind of no reason to doubt that the guy's name who wrote them is Matthew or Mark or John. That doesn't answer who Luke was. Was he Luke with Paul? Was he, was Matthew the brother of Jesus? Was Mark John Mark? That doesn't get answered. But what does Luke believe about Jesus in the early church? And so on with the canon of the New Testament. Then, what does Ignatius of Antioch write about to the Smyrnians? What does he emphasize? What does he not say? And on and on. Then onto his letters to Philadelphia, Rome, etc. Then onto other early church writings. Then how does Tacitus view the Christians? And what does he say about them? And then going on and on from the Roman, the Greek, the Jewish. Now, one thing that we find, people say, oh, well, Mark was just a collaboration of looking back on the Old Testament. The group that produced Mark, the church that produced Mark, because it was obviously a member of the church within a community that wrote Mark. The church existed prior to the scriptures being written down. And the scriptures that we see in the 27-book New Testament are from various authors that some of them didn't have any knowledge the other one was writing. Many of them can be seen as contradictory or even opposing one another. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. What do they believe about Jesus? What do they say about Jesus? What's unique to them? These questions. Now, even when trying to forward their view of Jesus, is there an embarrassment factor in them? yes, Mark has a great embarrassment factor to him. If this Jesus was just a myth, then why are there offhand things? The writer of Mark seems to believe that Jesus was a man, and he treats Jesus like a man, putting in a lot of stuff, even if it's embarrassing, but just events that he knows for sure happened, and then put in stuff like the Son of God never comes out of his mouth, but it's constantly in the narration of Mark, at least the first 2/3. Well, and the last third, which are thought to have two different authors or be written by the same author at two different dates. So why wouldn't he just put it in the mouth of Jesus? Why does he write that Jesus' mother, brother, and sisters think he's insane and they're worried about him? In John, when John's trying to forward that Jesus is the son of David, why does he have a guy saying, we know where you're from Galilee, you're from up north, and have Jesus visiting up north? In Matthew's Judaized gospel, why does it leave in a lot of the embarrassing stuff from Mark and even bring in with Q things that don't necessarily jive with Matthew's theology of the Jew, or worldview of the Jew first and then the Gentile and keep Jewish law? They seem to treat this Jesus of Nazareth, and it's pretty blatant that he was an actual person that lived. Now, putting the virgin birth in to overcome Mark, and then Luke putting his own version of virgin birth into combat Matthew, that's to be expected. And miracles getting ramped up bigger and bigger as the competition goes is also to be expected. And that's exactly what we see with Mark, Matthew, and Luke, of competing men from different church groups that are competing with each other in the very earliest time. Does any early Christian think that Jesus was a myth or a figment of the imagination? No, there's no evidence to show that. Paul, everything about Paul that talks about him, he had flesh, he has a brother named James, he's born of a woman, he's descended from David, all this kind of stuff shows him that Paul believed he was a real man, and that Paul knew his brother. Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome was right in 89. Ignatius, who's writing AD 105, they seem staunchly to believe that Jesus was a real man, as well as being the Son of God or the Logos or a prophet. And Ignatius even goes to his death. When Tacitus writes about the Christians, he sees them as stubborn. He kills the two deaconesses because he views them as fanatics, that they actually believed Jesus was a real man. They believed he rose from the dead. So it's when people come in, it's mythicism. This is why scholars don't believe any of this, because when you can come at anything and say, oh, it's just a myth, and do what Joseph Atwell did or anything, but it's not. I mean, there's no way somebody can come at it and look in depth at what is written and see what the scholars have said, and then walk away and say, yeah, it's a myth. Because there's too much points of embarrassment, and everybody treats it like he's a man, and then they have to add their own theology to push it forward. And not all the Gospels have the same. Some of them have events peculiar to them. I'm going to have to stop because of the time. But it's not, if you're used to reading history, and especially first century history, and what that deals with, the idea that this was created of a myth has no basis. The simplest explanation, the obvious explanation, the simplest explanation, the only explanation that accounts for any of the works in the New Testament or outside of the New Testament or the existence of the early church in the first and second centuries is this itinerant preacher went around, he got a following, and after his death at the hands of the Romans, his brand of his sect of Judaism grew and eventually grew out of being just Jewish and became its own thing and then ran wild. Peace to you.